but certainly working with the car across the weekend was easier. The balance of the car was more consistent.
Hi, I'm Jodie with Shove here to answer your questions from the Japanese Grand Prix. So, a question in from one of our fans: why did we only set one timed lap in Q1?
Well, that goes back to a decision to take 4 sets of soft tyres into qualifying. That meant that we had 2 of the hard, 1 of the medium for the race on Sunday. And if you've got 4 sets, the way to have 2 new soft in Q3 is that you get through Q1 on 1 soft and Q2 on 1 soft, and then you've got 2 bites at the cherry in final qualifying. So that's what we were trying to achieve. Now, different to tracks like Melbourne and Jeddah, the degradation there is very, very high. And when you've done that single lap, if you try to do another run on it, it will probably be at least half a second off, maybe a little bit more. So we didn't really want to just do another run on used, because you're just wearing out the tyre that we could then start qualifying 2 on. We definitely didn't want to take another new set, because that would have meant that we didn't have those 2 sets for the final session.
So, why did we switch to the hard tyre for Lewis and George at the restart after the red flag?
Well, principally, we thought that would be a way to be a bit different. So the teams in the top 10 that had 2 hard, that was us and McLaren. Red Bull and Ferrari had 2 of the mediums. And at that point, there wasn't really enough information to know how that hard and medium were going to compare. There was only limited running from across the weekend. So part of it was to try and be a bit different. It would certainly be an easier way of achieving a 1-stop with 2 hards than with a medium and a hard. And because of that red flag, we'd already run the medium. So as far as the rules are concerned, that single lap prior to the red flag means you've run the medium, and you would be allowed to effectively do a hard 1-stop. Was one of the reasons. And then looking further down the grid, there wasn't really any threat from the other teams. They were slower than us and not likely to interact. So really, it was about offsetting. Now the issue was that the end of our hard stint wasn't good enough. We were dropping off. We lost a fair bit of time in traffic, but fundamentally we weren't quick enough, and we're just trying to understand that now. But it was about doing the most easy 1-stop from there.
So, looking at tyre degradation at that point in the race, were we confident at that point that we could have done the 1-stop?
We weren't really confident, and going into the race, we were talking it was a 2-stop as the default strategy. Technically, you can do a 1, but it's just difficult to hang on to them, and you need good degradation. But as I said, it was more that the hard effective 1-stop from lap 2 was an easier strategy to execute than a medium hard.
What happened to our pace in the first stint for both cars?
Well, it was okay initially, and then by about half distance we started to drop off. We also got a bit of traffic. Now the tyres in Suzuka run quite hot. There's a bit of overheating, and when you get some traffic, it just drops the grip, causes a bit more sliding. And specifically, we were struggling with the slower corners. So there's a hairpin, the slow chicane as well. They were where we were losing a fair chunk of that time, and it was quite difficult once we got to that stage of the stint. As I said, made worse when we had a car in front, but it was difficult to get the car turned, and it was just costing us a bit in both of those corners. And then obviously, as the tyres are just getting older, the sliding goes up and the temperatures get a bit higher, and that was just compounding it. But I wouldn't say we've got a complete understanding of that issue now. It's obviously very soon after the race. That's one of the jobs that we're going to be getting into in the next few days, trying to work out exactly what happened and why did we drop off so much more than, for instance, Leclerc, who did a very good first stint that was a lot longer.
Why did we switch to the mediums later on in the race? When did we realise that the 1-stop wasn't going to be possible?
Yeah, I mean, we were starting to realise that, to be honest, at the point that we dropped off on that first stint. Now, you keep your options open. There's nothing that really prevents you sort of converting until you decide it's time to do so. But we stayed out a bit longer on that second stint to build a bit of a gap. We may have benefited from a safety car, but there wasn't one. But you don't want to stay out so long that you can't then catch up. Now, we've done the analysis on the tyre curves now, and the hard and the medium don't look very different. It was certainly cooler at the end of the race, which may have been helping, but the second stint and the third stint were okay. So we know that we're not quick enough. We know that there's a good sized gap to Red Bull that we need to close down, and there's a bit of a gap to Norris, to the Ferraris, that we need to work on. But certainly the performance of the car was where we expected it to be in stint 2 and stint 3.
So did we get an answer in the end of what caused the vibration on George's steering wheel during the end of the first stint?
Yeah, that was just a lock-up at turn 2. He did a good job of trying to not make it too bad. So when the drivers get into that situation, it will cause them a problem if the wheel is locked solid and it stays like that all the way round the corner, because you end up with something that's a bit like a 50-pence piece. It's got a flat part, and it will be giving them a headache by the end of the stint. So what he tried to do is actually just keep the wheel rotating a bit, so it doesn't just wear that one bit into a big flat spot. So it's a bit of a irritation to him. You've got to live with it. But actually, he did a good job to mean that wasn't such a problem, that he's back in for a new tyre.
So we heard from Bono that Lewis had picked up some damage on the front end plate. Did that cause any effect on his performance?
It did lose a bit, and more than the sort of absolute amount of downforce you lost, it just made the car a bit more understeery on a stint where we were probably already a little bit on the understeery side. And the track was hot, so on the grid we took a little bit of wing out for that. But that additional loss then caused him problems, and he was actually quite front limited throughout that first stint. Now, at the pit stop, we didn't change the wing, but we can put some flap angle back in it. You can put a bit more load on, and that actually put the car in a much better place. So, as I said, it's not in terms of headline numbers, not a lot of lap time when you can balance it out, but certainly adding to the problems that we had during stint 1.
Why didn't we pit Lewis for the fastest lap?
Well, we did have clear track behind, so we were talking about it. The reason that we decided not to was just we weren't sure whether he would get close enough to Piastri. We didn't know what would happen with George, who was closing in on Alonso. So there was a reasonable chance of some racing, and you've obviously got to come in on the penultimate lap because you've got to do your out lap to set the time on the fastest lap. And at that point, we weren't quite ready to rule out all possibility of either Lewis being able to gain a place or something with George and Alonso that might have brought him into play. So it was just that we felt the sort of upside game was enough to leave him out on track.
So, Shov, this is a question specifically for you. We know that we travel all around the world, 24 races on the calendar. So most importantly, did you enjoy the Japanese food?
I do like Japanese food. What I said before was I wouldn't have sushi for dinner because it's a snack, not a meal, is my own view on it. But I do like sushi, and we got out. We had a barbecue on Sunday night, which was good fun before we came back. But yeah, it's a great race, and the fans are incredible there, and we all enjoy going.
Wasabi or no wasabi?
Always wasabi, yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
So what are our key takeaways from being at Suzuka going forward now into China?
The big program we were looking at was to try and get the car a bit more predictable through the weekend. And what we found is that we can get it in a window, but if the wind changes, the track temp changes, it quickly falls out of it. And that was leading to poor performance in race and qualifying. Now, there's no doubt that we're not where we need to be at the moment. We know that, and we know that we've got work to do. But certainly working with the car across the weekend was easier. The balance of the car was more consistent. There are issues that we need to get on top of and get on top of quickly. But certainly we seem to have a more stable platform, one where its behaviour through the whole weekend is more consistent. But as I said, we know that there's work to do, and we'll be working on that immediately.
And as we haven't been to China racing since 2019, does that change our preparations ahead of the race?
Well, I mean, it's a good challenge, that, because not just have we not been there for a while, we're straight into a sprint race, and it's also the new format where you've got two parc fermes, so a sprint qualifying and a sprint race, then an opportunity to change the car, and then the main qualifying and the main race. But we're reviewing the historic data. Now, we've not been there with this generation of cars, so the tyres are different, the aerodynamics is very different. There's a lot of work that we need to do, and the bulk of that work gets done in simulation. But there is also a bit of just rereading old notes, looking at how the tyres were performing in terms of tyre wear, what was driving degradation, to try and build that picture. But we've only got 1 hour of free practice before we're going straight into that qualifying session. So definitely a big challenge, but it's quite fun, and there's good motivation to work on it, because if you can get it right, the opportunities at a sprint race are always greater, because someone else may have got it wrong.